The moment I realized my career was being stolen happened at 2:37 a.m. on a Wednesday in March, but I didn't understand what I was seeing until much later. I was sitting at my desk in the empty office on the 23rd floor of our building in downtown Chicago, the kind of late night that had become routine over the past 8 months, staring at my laptop screen with code scrolling past and energy drinks littering my workspace like evidence of my deteriorating work-life balance. I'd just pushed the final commit on a project that was going to change everything for our company, a complete rebuild of our authentication and data processing pipeline that would save us millions in infrastructure costs and scale us to handle 10 times our current user load. 8 months of work, nearly 1,200 hours of research, testing, debugging, documentation, architecture design, code review, and optimization. Late nights, sacrificed weekends, missed family gatherings, canceled dates, postponed vacation days, all culminating in this moment, this final push to the repository at 2:37 a.m., 5 days before the big executive presentation that would determine our company's Series D funding round. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt exhausted and vaguely uneasy, though I couldn't articulate why. There was a knot in my stomach that had been tightening for weeks, a feeling that something was wrong, that I was missing something important, that I was walking toward a cliff I couldn't see yet. I'm Maya Okafor, 31 years old, and I'm a senior software engineer at TechVantage Solutions, a Chicago-based SaaS company that provides enterprise resource planning software to Fortune 500 companies. We're one of those startups that's not really a startup anymore. 320 employees across engineering, product, sales, marketing, and operations, 85 million in annual recurring revenue, Series C funded with Sequoia and Andreessen Horowitz on our cap table, offices in a converted warehouse in the West Loop with exposed brick and standing desks, and cold brew on tap, and all the other trappings of successful tech culture. I'd been at TechVantage for 4.5 years, working my way up from junior engineer to mid-level engineer to senior engineer, building a reputation as someone who could solve the impossible problems, who could architect systems that scaled, who could take a messy codebase held together with duct tape and prayer and turn it into something elegant and maintainable and actually documented. I loved my work with an intensity that sometimes worried my family, loved the puzzle of it, the creative problem solving, the satisfaction of building something from nothing and watching it work beautifully under load. My parents, Nigerian immigrants who'd come to the States in the early 80s, my father a cardiologist, my mother a professor of African studies at Northwestern, had raised me to value education and excellence above almost everything else. My older brother Chidi was a corporate lawyer in New York pulling in obscene money at a white shoe firm. My younger sister Amara was finishing her residency in pediatrics at Children's Memorial, and I was the tech person, the one who'd chosen computers over medicine or law. "You're wasting your brain," my mother used to say when I was in college at MIT studying computer science instead of pre-med like she'd hoped. "You should be a doctor like your father. Or a real engineer who builds bridges and buildings." I am an engineer, Mom. Software engineer. That's not a real engineer. Real engineers build things you can touch. Software runs everything now. The bridge your real engineer designs, calculated by software I could write. The hospital where Dad works, runs on software. The phone you're calling me from, nothing but software. She'd come around eventually, especially after I landed the job at TechVantage with a base salary of $130,000 plus equity and benefits. Success, in my family, was measured in tangible outcomes and the ability to support yourself without help, and I was delivering both. But even as my career flourished, even as I got promotions and raises and increasingly complex projects, my mother would sometimes shake her head and say, "I still don't understand what exactly you do all day." "I build systems that other systems depend on, Mom." Infrastructure. The foundation that holds everything else up. Like plumbing? Exactly like plumbing. Expensive, critical plumbing that no one notices until it breaks. The authentication and data processing project, which we'd codenamed Project Fortress because our CTO Derek Chen thought it sounded cool and secure, had started 8 months earlier in July 2024. Derek had called an all-hands engineering meeting to discuss a critical problem that was keeping him up at night. Our current authentication system and data pipeline were fundamentally broken. We're using OAuth 2, 0 for authentication, but it's implemented incorrectly in at least 7 places I can count, Derek had explained, his hands waving expressively the way they always did when he was passionate about something technical. He was Chinese-American, early 40s, MIT PhD, one of those brilliant engineers who'd become a CTO more by accident than design, and was constantly overwhelmed by the management responsibilities he didn't actually want. We have security vulnerabilities that make me wake up sweating at 3 a.m. We can't scale past 1 million concurrent users without the whole system grinding to a halt. We're spending obscene amounts, I'm talking hundreds of thousands monthly, on cloud infrastructure costs because the system is so inefficient. And our data processing pipeline? It's a disaster. We're using batch processing when we should be streaming, we have data consistency issues, we have no proper error handling. The whole thing is held together with technical debt and hope. The room had gone very quiet. Every engineer in that conference room knew what a complete rebuild meant. Months of intensive work, extremely high stakes, the potential for catastrophic failure if anything went wrong, and the kind of career-defining success if you pulled it off. I need someone to lead this, Derek had continued, looking around the room with an expression somewhere between desperation and hope. Someone who understands security architecture, who can design systems that scale horizontally, who can manage the complexity of rebuilding critical infrastructure while keeping the current system running. This is going to be the foundation of everything we build for the next 5 years minimum. This is the project that will determine whether we can actually scale to the size our board and investors expect. Several senior engineers had raised their hands, including me, and including Brandon Walsh, a senior engineer who'd joined the company around the same time I had, back in late 2019, right before the pandemic changed everything. Brandon was the kind of person who looked like he belonged in tech. 6 feet tall, white, sandy brown hair, always styled just right, went to Stanford for undergrad and Berkeley for his master's, had internships at Google and Facebook on his resume, possessed that particular brand of casual confidence that came from never having to prove himself, never having to work twice as hard for half the recognition, never having to wonder if people were taking him seriously or just tolerating him. He was good at his job, competent, reliable, could write clean code and understood system design well enough. We'd worked on several projects together over the years, had a cordial professional relationship built on mutual respect and occasional collaboration, grabbed lunch sometimes in the company cafeteria where we'd talk about tech trends and our favorite programming languages, and whether Vim or Emacs was superior, conversations that meant nothing and everything in the ecosystem of tech culture. I didn't dislike Brandon. I just didn't think about him much one way or another. He was a colleague. Nothing more, nothing less. Someone I'd work with on projects, someone I'd see in meetings, someone who existed in my professional orbit, but not my personal one. I should have paid more attention. Derek had looked around the room at the raised hands, considering his options with the weight of someone making a decision that would shape the next year of his life and possibly the future of the company. His eyes had lingered on several of us, me, Brandon, 2 other senior engineers named Priya and Marcus, who'd been with the company longer. Maya, Derek had said finally, I want you to lead this. You've got the deepest expertise in authentication systems and distributed architectures. You led the migration to microservices last year, and that went flawlessly. You've shown you can handle high-stakes projects with lots of dependencies and potential for everything to explode spectacularly. Brandon, I want you to support her. Be a second pair of eyes, someone she can bounce ideas off, help with implementation when she needs it. Priya and Marcus, I want you both available for code review and architecture consultation. But Maya's the lead. She owns this. Understood? I'd felt pride and terror in equal measure, that particular cocktail of emotions that comes when you're given exactly what you wanted and immediately start doubting whether you can actually deliver it. This was the kind of project that could make or break a career. If I succeeded, I'd be positioned for promotion to principal engineer or staff engineer, maybe even engineering manager if I wanted to go that route. If I failed, everyone would know. Failure in tech wasn't quiet. It was spectacular, public, and career-defining. Thank you, I'd said to Derek after the meeting, trying to keep my voice steady despite the butterflies in my stomach. I won't let you down. I know you won't. That's why I chose you. You're methodical, you document everything, you think about edge cases, and you don't take shortcuts. Those are exactly the qualities this project needs. The first few weeks of the project had been exhilarating in the way that only the beginning of something big and important can be. I'd started by doing a complete audit of the existing system. Every line of code in our authentication service, every configuration file, every API endpoint, every integration point with our data processing pipeline. I'd documented all the vulnerabilities, all the scalability bottlenecks, all the technical debt we'd accumulated over 5 years of rapid growth and move fast and break things mentality. The audit alone had taken 3 weeks and resulted in a 47-page document that made Derek visibly pale when he read it. "It's worse than I thought," he'd said. "It's exactly as bad as you thought. You just didn't have it all quantified in one place before. But the good news is that now we have a comprehensive roadmap of what needs to be fixed." Then I'd started designing the new architecture. A modern, secure, horizontally scalable authentication system using industry best practices, JSON web tokens with proper rotation and revocation, refresh token mechanism, proper encryption at rest and in transit, rate limiting to prevent DDoS attacks, multi-factor authentication support, session management that actually worked, audit logging for security compliance. And for the data pipeline, shifting from batch processing to stream processing using Apache Kafka, implementing proper error handling and retry logic, ensuring data consistency across distributed systems, building and monitoring and alerting so we'd know immediately if something broke. I'd spent 5 weeks on the design, creating detailed architecture diagrams, writing specifications for every component, documenting every decision and the reasoning behind it, presenting my plans to Derek and our VP of Engineering, Rachel Martinez, and our principal architect, an older white man named Tom, who'd been in tech since before I was born and knew every possible way a system could fail. "This is extremely solid work," Tom had said after reviewing my design documents. "This is the level of thinking I expect from principal engineers. You've anticipated edge cases I didn't even think to ask about." "This is brilliant," Derek had said after my formal presentation. "This is exactly what we need. How long do you think implementation will take?" 4 months minimum if everything goes perfectly, which it won't. 6 months realistically. Maybe 8 if we hit major blockers. You've got 6 months. Series D pitches in March. We need this live and proven before then. Brandon had been supportive during those early months of design and planning. He'd attended all the design meetings, asked good questions that made me think harder about my decisions, offered suggestions that occasionally improved the architecture, reviewed my documentation, and caught typos and unclear explanations. He'd been helpful in exactly the way a strong second-in-command should be, present and engaged, but not overbearing, contributing without trying to take over, supporting without micromanaging. "This is really impressive, Maya," he'd said after one design review meeting. "I'm learning a lot just from watching how you approach system design. Thanks. I've made every mistake possible over the years, so now I'm just trying not to repeat them." "Well, your checklist for avoiding mistakes is now my checklist, too. I'm stealing all your best practices." At the time, I'd taken it as a compliment. Looking back, I should have heard the warning in those words. I'm stealing. I'd started implementation in September 2024, diving into the code with the kind of focus that made the rest of the world disappear. Writing the core authentication logic, building out the API endpoints, setting up the Kafka streams for data processing, implementing the error handling and retry mechanisms, building the monitoring and alerting infrastructure, writing comprehensive tests for everything, because untested code in a critical system was just asking for disaster. Brandon had worked on peripheral features, password reset flows that sent emails and validated tokens, email verification systems, session management UI, some of the administrative dashboards that would let customer support teams help users with account issues. Important work, necessary work, but not the core architecture, not the critical path items that the whole system depended on. We'd communicated constantly through Slack, our team channel, direct messages, thread replies that went dozens of messages deep as we debugged issues and discussed implementation details. I'd message him about bugs I was fixing, design decisions I was making, features I was implementing, problems I'd encountered and how I'd solve them. He'd respond with feedback, questions, acknowledgements, suggestions. Our Slack channel became a running record of every decision, every change, every piece of work we'd done over 8 months. I kept detailed notes because that's how I worked. Organized, methodical, documented. Every commit to our Git repository was carefully messaged explaining what changed and why. Every architectural decision got documented in our wiki. Every meeting got notes posted to Confluence. I didn't do this because I was worried about credit theft. I did it because good engineering required good documentation, because the Maya who'd be maintaining this system in 2 years would thank the Maya who'd built it for leaving clear notes, because I'd inherited too many undocumented systems in my career and sworn I'd never inflict that pain on anyone else. I didn't realize I was building my own defense system. By December 2024, 4 months into implementation, the core system was working. The authentication service could handle logins and token generation. The data processing pipeline could stream events through Kafka and update our databases consistently. We'd stress tested it and found it could handle the load we'd designed for. By February 2025, 6 months in, we were in the polishing phase. Bug fixes, performance optimizations, edge case handling, integration testing with all our other services, security audits, load testing at increasingly ridiculous scales. The system was solid, stable, ready to present. And that's when things started to feel wrong, though I couldn't identify what was bothering me. Brandon had started acting differently in subtle ways I couldn't quite pin down. He was still helpful, still responsive, still doing his assigned work. But something about our dynamic had shifted in ways I couldn't articulate even to myself. He'd started speaking up more in meetings, offering opinions on aspects of the architecture he hadn't been involved in designing. He'd started using I and we in ways that felt slightly off. I'm thinking we should optimize this differently. I'm considering a refactor of this component, about parts of the system I'd built and he'd only reviewed. None of it was overtly wrong. Engineers used I and we interchangeably all the time. People offered opinions on work they hadn't done. That was normal collaboration, normal team dynamics. But something about the pattern felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. I just felt it. I mentioned it to my best friend and coworker, Jasmine Rodriguez, during a coffee break in early March, about 2 weeks before the big presentation. Jasmine was a senior product manager, had worked at Tech Vantage for 5.5 years, was one of the few other women of color in senior roles, and had become my closest friend at the company through the shared experience of navigating tech while being constantly underestimated. I don't know how to explain this without sounding paranoid, I told her, stirring my overpriced oat milk latte from the artisanal coffee shop on the first floor of our building. But Brandon's been weird lately. Weird how? Just the way he talks about the project, like he's more central to it than he actually is. Little things in meetings and Slack messages to Derek, in the way he explains things to other engineers. Nothing I can point to specifically, just a vibe. Trust your gut, Maya. Women's intuition about this stuff is usually right, especially in tech where men are always trying to take credit for our work. But I don't have evidence, just a feeling. And feelings aren't actionable. Then create evidence, document everything, screenshot conversations, make sure your work is clearly attributed in commit messages and code comments. Cover your ass. That feels paranoid. That feels smart. I've seen this too many times. Guy is supportive and helpful while you're doing the work. Then suddenly during the recognition phase, he somehow co-led the project, even though everyone knows you did the heavy lifting. Brandon wouldn't do that. He's always been straight with me. Jasmine gave me a look that said she'd heard these words before and they were always wrong. Just document everything. Just in case. So I did. Not because I truly believed Brandon was going to steal my credit. I still couldn't imagine him being that bold, that dishonest. But because Jasmine's warning had activated some defensive instinct I didn't know I had. I started taking screenshots of Slack conversations showing who proposed what ideas, who designed which components, who wrote what code. I backed up commit histories showing the timestamp and author of every change. I made copies of design documents with my name on them, architecture diagrams I'd created, meeting notes I'd written. I felt ridiculous doing it, like I was being paranoid, like I was betraying the trust of a colleague who'd been nothing but supportive, like I was importing drama from other people's experiences instead of trusting my own. But I kept doing it, just in case. On March 15th, 5 days before the presentation, Derek called me into his office. I walked in expecting praise, maybe a preview of the board presentation, perhaps even an early conversation about my promotion to principal engineer. Instead, Derek looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact in the way people do when they're about to deliver bad news they don't want to own. Maya, we need to talk about the presentation on the 20th. Sure. Do you want me to change anything in the slides? Add more technical detail or focus more on business impact? Actually, I've decided Brandon should present instead of you. The words hit me like cold water. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. What? Brandon's going to do the presentation to the board. You'll be there to answer technical questions if needed, but he'll be the primary presenter. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Why? This is my project. I led the architecture, I did the majority of the implementation, I understand every decision and trade-off. I know, and you've done excellent work. But Brandon has more presentation experience. He's better with executives, better at distilling technical concepts into business language. And frankly, Maya, you look exhausted. You've been working yourself to death on this project. I'm worried you're going to burn out if we put you in front of the board in this state. I'm not going to burn out. I'm ready to present. I know this system inside and out because I built it. Brandon knows the parts he worked on, but he doesn't know the core architecture the way I do. I've made my decision. Brandon presents, you support. That's final. And honestly, Maya, you should be grateful. Presenting to the board is stressful. This way you can just focus on the technical work you're good at and let Brandon handle the executive communication you find draining. I should be grateful. He was telling me I should be grateful that someone else was going to present my work, that I was being benched for the recognition phase after doing the hard labor for 8 months. Derek, I've presented to executives before. I presented the microservices migration last year and it went fine. This is different. This is the board. This is our Series D pitch. This is the presentation that determines whether we get $200 million in funding or whether we have to cut costs and potentially lay people off. The stakes are too high to risk it. Risk what? Risk me presenting my own work? Maya, I've made my decision. I'm sorry if you're disappointed, but this is what's best for the company. I left his office feeling like I'd been kicked in the stomach, like someone had stolen something from me and was trying to convince me it was for my own good. I couldn't breathe right. My hands were shaking. I wanted to scream or cry or throw something, but instead I walked calmly to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. 8 months of work, hundreds of late nights, sacrificed weekends and missed family events and postponed life milestones. Also, someone else could stand in front of the board and take credit for what I'd built. I texted Jasmine. You were right. Brandon's presenting my project. Derek just told me. Her response came back immediately. Are you fucking kidding me? I wish I was. What are you going to do? I didn't have an answer. I sat in that bathroom stall for 20 minutes, trying to figure out what my options were. I could complain, but Derek had made it clear the decision was final. I could refuse to support Brandon, but that would just hurt the company, and probably my own reputation. I could quit and protest, but that felt like cutting off my nose to spite my face. Or I could show up to the presentation and watch someone else take credit for my work and hate myself for it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my apartment in Wicker Park, a 1-bedroom I paid too much rent for because that's what Chicago housing cost, staring at the ceiling and replaying every interaction I'd had with Brandon over the past 8 months. Had there been signs I'd missed? Moments where he'd been positioning himself to take credit? Conversations where he'd subtly elevated his role? At 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and opened my laptop, started systematically going through our Slack channel, reading every message from the beginning of Project Fortress. And that's when I saw it. The pattern that had been invisible while I was living through it but became obvious when I looked at the whole arc at once. In our early conversations from July and August 2024, Brandon had been clearly supportive and secondary. Great design, Maya. That makes sense. I'll implement the features you outlined. Let me know if you need help with that. I'll handle the password reset flow while you work on the core auth logic. His language positioned me as the leader and him as the support. Clear, unambiguous, exactly what Derek had outlined in that first meeting. But somewhere around October, his language had started shifting. Subtle changes in how he described the work. We should consider this approach. I'm thinking we could optimize this differently. Let me make this architectural decision. Not overtly wrong. We were collaborating after all, but subtly repositioning himself from support to co-lead. And in his communications with Derek and other leadership, communications he'd CC'd me on, so I'd seen them at the time but hadn't registered the significance, he'd started using I and my more frequently. November email to Derek. I'm making good progress on the authentication system. The core architecture is coming together nicely. December Slack message to Rachel. My approach to the data pipeline is showing strong performance improvements in testing. January email to Tom. I've architected the system to handle horizontal scaling. We should be able to support 10x user growth. February Slack to the executive team. I've completed the security audit and addressed all the vulnerabilities. The system is ready for production. He was systematically rewriting the narrative, taking credit for design decisions I'd made, implementation work I'd done, architecture I'd built. And he was doing it in communications with leadership, the people who would determine recognition, promotion, and compensation. Meanwhile, in his direct communications with me, he'd maintained the supportive, collaborative tone, still saying great work and this looks good, and let me know how I can help. Playing 2 different roles, the supportive colleague to my face, the project lead to leadership. And I'd been too buried in the actual work to notice that he was building a parallel narrative where he was the hero and I was, what? His assistant, his implementer, invisible. I started taking screenshots of everything. The early Slack messages where he clearly positioned me as lead. The later messages where he started taking credit. The commit history from our JIT repository showing that I'd written 87% of the code. The design documents in Confluence showing my name as author. The architecture diagrams showing my username in the file metadata. I created a folder on my personal Google Drive, not the company drive where Derek or Brandon might see it, and backed up everything. Every piece of evidence showing who had actually led this project, who had done the work, who deserved the credit. I did this at 4 a.m. on March 16th, 5 days before the presentation, running on zero sleep and pure rage, my hands shaking as I collected proof of my own work like I was preparing for trial. And I felt pathetic doing it. Felt like I should be able to just tell Derek or Rachel or anyone that this wasn't right, that Brandon was stealing my credit, and have them believe me. Felt like I shouldn't need documentation to prove I'd done work that everyone had watched me do. But I knew better. I'd been in tech long enough to know that without proof, it would be my word against Brandon's. And whose word got believed in those situations? The confident white Stanford guy, or the black woman with an attitude problem who couldn't just be grateful for the opportunity to work on a high-profile project? By the time the sun came up on March 16th, I had everything documented and backed up. Every Slack message, every email, every commit, every design document, every piece of evidence showing my leadership and his support role. And I had a plan. Not a good plan, not a safe plan, but a plan. If Brandon tried to present my work as his own, I would call him out, publicly, with evidence. Consequences be damned. The next few days, March 16th through March 19th, were surreal. I went to work, attended meetings, responded to Slack messages, did final bug fixes on the system. Brandon acted normal, friendly, like nothing was wrong. Maybe he genuinely thought he deserved to present. Maybe he'd internalized his own revised narrative where he'd been the leader all along. Maybe he knew exactly what he was doing and just didn't care. I couldn't tell which scenario was true, and I wasn't sure which would make me angrier. On March 17th, I had lunch with Jasmine and showed her everything I'd documented. "This is insane," she said, scrolling through screenshots on my laptop while picking at her salad. "He literally repositioned himself over the course of 8 months. This is calculated. Or maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe he just naturally started feeling more ownership as he worked on the project longer. Maya, stop making excuses for him. Look at this message from February." She pointed at her screen. "I've designed the system to handle our scaling needs." You designed the system. He reviewed it and implemented peripheral features. Maybe he misspoke. Black women don't get to misspeak about their accomplishments without being called arrogant. White men get to claim credit for things they barely touched and everyone just accepts it. That's not an accident. That's the system working as designed. So what do? You walk into that boardroom with your documentation ready. And if he tries to take credit for your work, you politely and professionally show everyone the receipts. You make it impossible for them to ignore who actually built this thing. That could blow up in my face. I could look petty, vindictive, like I can't handle not being the center of attention. You could also establish clear boundaries about your work being stolen and set a precedent that you won't tolerate it. Which do you think is more important for your career long-term? She was right. I knew she was right. But knowing something intellectually and having the courage to do it were very different things. March 19th, the day before the presentation, I did a practice run with Brandon. He'd asked me to review his slides, make sure the technical details were accurate, coach him on the parts he wasn't as familiar with. I sat through his presentation in a conference room, just the two of us, and watched him claim credit for every significant decision, every architectural choice, every component I'd built. "I started by auditing the existing system," he said, showing a slide with my findings. "I designed a new architecture from the ground up," he continued, showing diagrams I'd created. "I implemented the core authentication logic," he explained, describing code I'd written. "I set up the Kafka streaming pipeline," he claimed, about infrastructure I'd configured. He used "I" almost exclusively. Not we, not the team, not Maya and I worked together. Just, I did this, I built that, I solved this problem. At one point, he actually said, Maya helped with some of the implementation details, like I'd been his assistant instead of his lead. I should have stopped him right there. Should have said, Actually, that's not accurate. I led this project. You supported. Let's make sure the presentation reflects reality. But I didn't. I sat there, gave technical feedback, corrected some details about how the system worked, and let him practice presenting my work as his own. Because some part of me still couldn't believe he'd actually do it. Couldn't believe he'd stand in front of the board and lie that blatantly. Couldn't believe Derek would let him. Couldn't believe this was really happening. That night, March 19th, I called my brother Chidi in New York. He'd just made partner at his law firm, was probably the most successful person in our family in terms of traditional markers, and had a particular clarity about workplace politics that came from years of navigating predominantly white corporate spaces. "They're giving your credit to the white guy?" he said after I explained the situation. "Of course they are. That's literally the most predictable thing that could happen. I don't know if I should say something or just let it go. Do you have documentation?" "Yes, everything. Slack messages, commit histories, design documents, all of it." "Then you have to say something. Because if you don't, this becomes the precedent. This becomes the story everyone believes. And the next time you do major work, they'll do the same thing because you've shown them you'll accept it." "But what if I look what? Professional? Like someone who won't let their work be stolen?" "Maya, I know Mom and Dad raised us to keep our heads down and work twice as hard and not make waves. But sometimes you have to make waves. Sometimes you have to be willing to burn bridges to protect your own reputation and career." "What if they fire me?" "For what? Having documentation showing you did your job? If they fire you for that, you lawyer up and you take them for everything they're worth. But they probably won't. Because companies are more afraid of public exposure than they are of having uncomfortable conversations about credit." After I hung up with Chidi, I sat with my laptop open, staring at the folder full of evidence I'd compiled. Tomorrow morning, I'd walk into that boardroom. Brandon would present my work as his own, and I'd have to decide in the moment whether to stay silent or speak up. I didn't sleep that night either. If you're still following this story, thank you for being here. Hit that subscribe button now, because what happens in that boardroom tomorrow is going to show you exactly why documentation matters, why having evidence is everything, and why sometimes the only way forward is through confrontation. March 20th, 2025, arrived with perfect weather. Sunny, 65 degrees, the kind of early spring day that felt like a gift after Chicago's brutal winter. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing what I thought of as my armor: a tailored navy blazer, cream silk blouse, black pants, low heels professional enough to be taken seriously but comfortable enough that I could run if I needed to. I did my makeup carefully, not trying to be invisible but not trying to stand out either. That careful calculation every woman of color makes about how to present in professional spaces where you're already hypervisible. I looked at myself in the mirror and practiced saying, "Actually, I need to clarify something about attribution." Practiced keeping my voice level, my face calm, my hands still. Practiced looking like someone who was simply correcting an error instead of someone who was terrified of being labeled angry or difficult or ungrateful. The boardroom was on the 25th floor of our building, 2 floors above our normal offices. I'd only been in it once before, during my interview process 4.5 years ago. It was designed to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago and Lake Michigan, a massive table that could seat 20 people, expensive leather chairs, state-of-the-art screens on every wall, the kind of space that cost more per square foot than most people's apartments. I arrived 15 minutes early, wanting to settle myself before everyone else arrived. But Brandon was already there, looking calm and confident in a button-down shirt and slacks, his laptop open, presentation slides ready. He smiled when he saw me, that easy smile of someone who had no idea what was about to happen. "Hey Maya, thanks for coming early. I wanted to go over a few last-minute things. Do you have a minute?" "Sure," I said, taking a seat at the table. Not at the head where the presenters usually sat, not in the back where observers hid, but somewhere in the middle, close enough to speak up if needed, but not so forward that I looked presumptuous. "I was thinking about the technical deep dive section," Brandon said, clicking through his slides. "If they ask about the specifics of how we handle token rotation, should I go into the cryptographic details or keep it high level?" "If they ask. Not, if you want to field that question." He was planning to answer everything himself, to be the sole source of information, to position me as backup at best and decoration at worst. "Depends on who's asking," I said carefully. "Tom will want the cryptographic details. Sarah and Marcus will want high level. The board members will probably want somewhere in between." "Good point. I'll prepare for both scenarios." People started arriving at 9:30. Derek looking nervous and fidgeting with his phone. Rachel Martinez, our VP of Engineering, looking sharp and competent as always in her signature red lipstick and black blazer. Tom, the principal architect, carrying his ubiquitous notebook where he wrote everything by hand because he claimed typing distracted him from thinking. And then the executives and board members started filing in. Sarah Lindstrom, our CEO, early 40s, had scaled 3 companies before TechVantage, was known for being brilliant and ruthless in equal measure. Marcus Johnson, our CFO, calm and analytical, the kind of person who could make the most terrifying financial projections sound reasonable. 3 board members whose names I knew from company emails but had never spoken to. Richard Chen from Sequoia, Patricia Morrison from Andreessen Horowitz, and David Okonkwo, who'd founded 2 successful startups before becoming an investor, plus several other senior leaders from our executive team. The room filled up, important people taking important seats, the air thick with the kind of anticipation that comes before presentations that determine a company's future. Brandon sat at the head of the table, presenter position, owner position, leader position. I stayed in my middle seat, trying to look engaged and supportive while my heart hammered against my ribs. Derek called the meeting to order at 10 a.m. sharp. Thank you all for being here. As you know, we've been working on a critical infrastructure project for the past 8 months. A complete rebuild of our authentication system and data processing pipeline. This addresses the security vulnerabilities and scaling limitations we've discussed at previous board meetings, and it's a key component of our Series D pitch to demonstrate technical maturity and scalability. Brandon Walsh, one of our senior engineers, has been leading this effort, and he's here to present the work today. Brandon Walsh has been leading this effort, not Maya Okafor. Not the person Derek had explicitly chosen to lead this project 8 months ago in front of 20 other engineers. Not the person who'd designed every aspect of the architecture, written 87% of the code, spent hundreds of hours making this work. Brandon. I felt my face go hot, felt my hands clench under the table, felt every muscle in my body tense with the effort of staying still and silent when what I wanted to do was stand up and scream that this wasn't true, that Derek was lying or misremembering or had been lied to. But I stayed quiet, waited, watched. Brandon stood up and began his presentation. His slides were good, clear, well-designed, hitting all the right points about business impact and technical innovation. And with every slide, every explanation, every architectural decision he described, my blood pressure rose and my resolve hardened. When I started this project 8 months ago, he said, I knew we had significant challenges. Our authentication system was fundamentally broken, our data pipeline couldn't scale, and we were spending enormous amounts on infrastructure that wasn't delivering value. When I started. Not when we started, not when the team started. When I started. I began by doing a comprehensive audit of our existing system, he continued, showing a slide with findings that came directly from the 47-page document I'd written. I documented every vulnerability, every bottleneck, every piece of technical debt that was holding us back. I documented my work, my analysis, my 47 pages of detailed findings presented as his work. I then designed a completely new architecture from the ground up, he said, showing the diagrams I'd created, the system design I'd spent 5 weeks perfecting. A modern, secure, horizontally scalable system that could handle our growth for the next 5 years. I designed. My architecture, my diagrams, my 5 weeks of work, claimed as his accomplishment. I made several key architectural decisions that enabled this outcome, he continued, listing decisions I'd made, trade-offs I'd analyzed, approaches I'd chosen after researching industry best practices and consulting with security experts. The presentation continued for 30 minutes. 30 minutes of Brandon taking credit for work I'd done, decisions I'd made, systems I'd built. He used I almost exclusively. I implemented, I optimized, I tested, with occasional uses of we when talking about the company's needs or goals, but never we when discussing who actually did the work. At one point, he said, I got some excellent support from our team, especially Maya, who helped with implementation details. And that was it. That was my only mention. 8 months of leading the project, hundreds of hours of work, all reduced to helped with implementation details, like I'd been checking his work instead of the other way around. I looked around the room. The executives were nodding, impressed. Sarah Lindstrom was smiling, making notes. Marcus Johnson was asking questions about cost savings. The board members looked satisfied, like they were seeing exactly what they needed to see to feel confident about their investment. No one was looking at me. No one was asking questions about who actually did the work. They were buying Brandon's narrative completely, just like Derek had, just like everyone would unless I did something to stop it. Brandon finished the main presentation and opened the floor for questions. Are there any questions about the technical approach or business impact? Rachel Martinez raised her hand. This is really impressive work, Brandon. Can you walk us through the security architecture in more detail? Specifically, how are you handling token validation and revocation? Brandon hesitated for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable unless you were watching for it, unless you knew that he hadn't actually designed the security architecture and was about to parrot information from the documentation I'd written. Absolutely, he said, recovering smoothly. The security architecture is based on industry best practices for JWT handling. We're using RS-256 asymmetric encryption for token signing, which means the public key can verify tokens but can't create them. For revocation, we maintain a deny list of invalidated tokens with TTLs matching the original token expiration. Correct information, accurate technical details, all from documentation I'd written explaining every aspect of how the security system worked. Tom, the principal architect, asked, "Why did you choose JWT over session-based authentication?" Another tiny hesitation. JWT provides better scalability because it's stateless, which means we don't need to maintain session data on our servers. This allows for easier horizontal scaling and reduces the load on our database systems. Again, correct. Again, surface-level understanding of a decision I'd made after deep analysis of the trade-offs, research into implementation patterns, consultation with security experts, and documentation of why this approach made sense for our specific use case. Patricia Morrison from Andreessen Horowitz leaned forward. What's the performance improvement compared to the old system? Do you have metrics? We're seeing dramatic improvements, Brandon said confidently, clicking to a slide showing performance graphs. These tests show we can now handle 10 times the concurrent users with better response times and significantly lower server costs. Those graphs were from load testing I'd run over 2 weeks in February, pushing the system to its limits, documenting every metric, creating visualizations that clearly showed the improvements we'd achieved. Sarah Lindstrom asked, "Walk me through the data processing pipeline changes. How does the new streaming architecture improve our capabilities?" Brandon explained the shift from batch to stream processing, how Kafka enabled real-time data handling, how we'd improved error handling and data consistency. All accurate, all technically sound, all from a system I'd designed and implemented while he'd worked on peripheral features. The questions continued for 20 minutes. Brandon answered all of them, never once deferring to me, never once acknowledging that someone else in the room might know more about certain aspects of the system. He held court like a professor giving a lecture, confident and authoritative, the expert explaining his creation. And everyone believed him. Richard Chen from Sequoia finally said what everyone was thinking. "Brandon, this positions us perfectly for Series D. The board has been concerned about our technical infrastructure and ability to scale. This work directly addresses those concerns. Excellent job." "Thank you," Brandon said, smiling. "It's been a challenging project, but very rewarding." Sarah Lindstrom nodded. "This is exactly the kind of technical leadership we need. Brandon, we should talk about your role going forward. I'm thinking principal engineer might be appropriate, possibly staff engineer." And that's when something in me snapped. Maybe it was the exhaustion from 8 months of late nights and weekends sacrificed. Maybe it was the rage at watching someone steal my work so blatantly, so completely. Maybe it was seeing everyone in that room believe his lies while I sat there invisible, erased, reduced to, helped with implementation details. Maybe it was knowing that if I stayed silent, this would become the truth, the story everyone would believe, the narrative that would define my career. Whatever it was, I stood up. "Actually," I said, my voice louder than I intended, cutting through the self-congratulatory mood in the room, "I have some questions." Everyone turned to look at me. Brandon's smile faltered, his face going pale in a way that made me think some part of him had known this moment might come. Derek started to speak, probably to shut me down. "Maya, if you have technical details to add—" "I have more than technical details," I interrupted, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I have questions about attribution." The room went very quiet. That particular silence that happens when everyone knows something significant is about to occur, but no one knows exactly what. Sarah Lindstrom's eyes narrowed, her CEO instincts recognizing that the script had just gone off book. "Attribution? Yes. Brandon's been using I a lot during this presentation. I designed. I implemented. I tested. I made these architectural decisions. But I'm curious, can someone pull up the Git commit history for this project? The actual statistics showing who wrote what code? Brandon's face went from pale to red. Maya, what are you doing? Just clarifying attribution, I said calmly. Since there seems to be some confusion about who actually led this project. Derek stood up, his voice sharp with warning. Maya, this is not appropriate. What's not appropriate? I said, keeping my voice level even though my hands were shaking. Is someone taking credit for 8 months of work they didn't do? Rachel, you have access to our GitHub repository, right? Rachel nodded slowly, confused but curious. Yes? Could you pull up the commit statistics for Project Fortress? Just the summary showing commits by author? Maya, stop this right now, Derek said, his voice taking on an edge of desperation. This is not the time or place. Actually, Sarah Lindstrom said, her CEO voice cutting through everything else, making it clear who actually had authority in the room. I'd like to see what Maya's talking about. Rachel, pull it up. Put it on the main screen. Rachel hesitated for just a moment, looking between Derek and Sarah, then made the smart choice and listened to the CEO. She opened her laptop, pulled up our GitHub organization, navigated to the Project Fortress repository, and projected the statistics onto the massive screen on the wall. The numbers appeared in stark black and white, undeniable and comprehensive. Project Fortress, commit statistics, July 2024, March 2025. Maya Okafor, 1,247 commits, 187,293 lines of code added, 52,441 lines removed. Brandon Walsh, 223 commits, 26,847 lines of code added, 9,012 lines removed. Priya Sharma, 31 commits, 3,012 lines added, 891 lines removed. Code reviews. Marcus Chen, 28 commits, 2,847 lines added, 643 lines removed. Code reviews. The silence in the room was absolute. Everyone staring at the screen, at the numbers that told a very different story than the one Brandon had just presented. Huh? Rachel said quietly, which might have been the understatement of the year. That's just commit volume, Brandon stammered, his confidence evaporating in real time. That doesn't show architectural decisions, design work, leadership, strategic thinking. You're right, I said, pulling out my phone with hands that were definitely shaking now. Let me show you the design work. I connected my phone to the presentation system. Thankfully, I'd tested this beforehand. Thankfully, our IT department kept things well integrated, and pulled up my personal Google Drive folder full of evidence I'd collected. Here's the first architectural design discussion, I said, displaying a Slack conversation from July 24th, 2024. Note the timestamp. Note who wrote the initial design proposal. That's me. Here's Brandon's response. This is really solid, Maya. Great thinking on the security approach. Let me know what parts I should work on. I let that message stay on the screen for a moment. Let everyone in the room read it and absorb the clear dynamic it established. Me leading, Brandon supporting. Here's the discussion about whether to use JWT or session-based auth, I continued, scrolling to another conversation from August. October 5th, my analysis of the trade-offs, my recommendation, my documentation of why this approach makes sense. Brandon's response, makes sense. I'll focus on the session management UI once you have the core auth working. I moved through the timeline methodically, showing key moments that established the reality of our working relationship versus the fiction Brandon had presented. November 3rd, discussion of the data pipeline architecture. My design document. I displayed a Google Doc with my name as author, created date of November 3rd, revised multiple times through November, outlining the shift from batch to stream processing, the Kafka configuration, the error handling approach. Brandon's feedback. This looks good. I'll work on the email notification integration you mentioned. December 12th, security audit findings and remediation plan. My 47-page document that took 3 weeks to create. Shared with Brandon for review. His response, thorough work. This is really comprehensive. Each message appeared on the screen with its timestamp, its author, its context. An irrefutable digital trail showing exactly who had done what work, who had led and who had supported, who had made decisions and who had implemented them. The room remained silent except for my voice and the soft click of my phone as I scrolled through evidence. January 8th, I continued, and this was where the story changed. First email from Brandon to Derek about the project. Note the language shift. I'm making good progress on the authentication system. The architecture is really coming together. I let that sit for a moment. The architecture that I designed 2 months earlier. that he had reviewed and approved but not created. February 14th. Message from Brandon to Rachel. My approach to the data pipeline is showing strong performance results in testing. The approach I had designed, the tests I had run, the results I had compiled. March 10th. Email from Brandon to the executive team. I've completed the final security audit and the system is ready for production. I looked directly at Brandon. The security audit I completed. The system I built. But you told leadership it was your work. Brandon looked like he wanted to disappear, sink through the floor, be anywhere but in that boardroom where his carefully constructed narrative was being demolished with timestamps and evidence. And today, I said, my voice getting slightly louder, we just watched a presentation where Brandon claimed to have led a project that commit history shows I did 84% of the work on, where he claimed to have designed architecture that documentation shows I created, where he claimed to have made decisions that Slack history shows I made, where he reduced my role to helped with implementation details, when the reality is that I led this project from start to finish. Richard Chen from Sequoia spoke up, his voice carefully neutral. Let me make sure I understand what we're looking at. These commit statistics show Maya did the vast majority of the actual coding work. Is that correct? That's correct, Rachel confirmed, still looking at her laptop screen. And the Slack conversations show that Maya was making the architectural decisions and Brandon was in a support role? That's what the timestamps and message content indicate. Yes. Patricia Morrison from Andreessen Horowitz leaned forward. Brandon, why did you present this work as solely your own? Why did you use I instead of we or Maya and I when discussing this project? Brandon opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Derek, maybe hoping his manager would save him, but Derek was staring at the screen with a look of growing horror. I thought... Brandon tried to form sentences but couldn't seem to complete them. I did important work too. The password reset system, the email verification, the administrative dashboards, supporting features, Tom interjected, looking at his notebook where he'd apparently been following along. Important and necessary, but not the core authentication system or data pipeline that this presentation was about. Sarah Lindstrom's expression had gone from interested to cold in the span of about 5 minutes. Brandon, I'm going to ask you a direct question. Did you tell Derek and others that you were leading this project? We were co-leading. The commit statistics show Maya did 84% of the work. The documentation shows she created the architecture. The Slack messages show she made the design decisions. Where exactly is the co in co-leading? I provided important strategic guidance. Did you? I interrupted, unable to stay quiet any longer. Because I have every Slack message we ever exchanged about this project, and I don't see a lot of strategic guidance. I see you asking questions about my design decisions. I see you implementing the features I assigned to you. I see you reviewing code I wrote and approving it. That's not strategic guidance. That's supporting someone else's leadership. David Okonkwo, the board member who'd been a founder himself, spoke up for the first time. This is a serious problem. Not just the misattribution, but the fact that we were about to make decisions about promotion and recognition based on false information. If Maya hadn't spoken up, we would have walked out of this meeting thinking Brandon led this work. That's exactly what would have happened, I said. And it's exactly what Brandon intended to happen. This wasn't a mistake or a miscommunication. Look at his language shifts over the course of 8 months. Look at how he gradually repositioned himself from support to lead in his communications with management. This was systematic. This was calculated. This was credit theft. The room erupted in overlapping conversations. Derek trying to explain to Sarah how this had happened. Rachel asking Tom if he'd seen the warning signs. The board members discussing among themselves what this meant for the company's culture and leadership. Brandon sat frozen in his chair, his presentation slides still up on the secondary screen, a monument to his attempted theft that was now evidence against him. Sarah finally raised her hand for silence. Everyone stop. I need to understand how we got here. Derek, you told us Brandon was leading this project. Why? Derek looked sick. I thought... Brandon told me he was taking the lead, that Maya was supporting him. He sent me regular updates positioning himself as the primary decision-maker. Did you verify that with Maya? No. I trusted Brandon's reports. And he seemed so confident, so on top of everything. Did you look at commit histories? Did you review the actual documentation to see who was creating it? No. I should have, but I didn't. I failed in my oversight responsibility. Sarah turned to me. Maya, when did you know this was happening? I started noticing something was wrong about 6 weeks ago. The way Brandon talked about the project in meetings felt off, but I didn't have clear evidence until a few weeks ago when I went back through our Slack history and saw how his language had shifted. That's when I realized he was systematically repositioning himself to take credit. Why didn't you come to me or Rachel immediately? Because I wasn't sure anyone would believe me without proof. Because credit theft allegations are easy to dismiss as interpersonal drama or someone being oversensitive. Because I'm a Black woman in tech and I know how that story usually goes. I'd be labeled as difficult or not a team player or someone who couldn't handle not being the center of attention. Sarah flinched at that, which told me she knew I was right. So I documented everything, I continued. Every Slack message, every commit, every piece of evidence showing who actually did what work. Because I knew if I was going to speak up, I needed undeniable proof. I needed to make it impossible to dismiss my claims as subjective interpretation or personality conflict. And you were right to do that, Sarah said. Because without this evidence, this would be he said, she said, and she trailed off. But everyone in the room knew how that sentence ended. Without evidence, Brandon's word would have been believed over mine. Patricia Morrison spoke up again. I want to be very clear about something. What we almost did here. Promoting and recognizing someone for work they didn't do while the person who actually did the work sat silently in the back of the room. That's not just unfair. That's a systemic problem. That's the kind of thing that drives talented people, especially women and people of color, out of tech. Agreed, David Okonkwo said. And I'm concerned about what this says about TechVantage's culture and management oversight. How many other projects have had similar misattributions that we don't know about because someone didn't have Maya's organizational skills or willingness to confront it? That question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah looked at Brandon. Her expression was ice. Brandon, you're suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation. If we confirm what seems obvious, you'll be terminated. Gather your personal items and leave the building. Sarah, please. Now, Brandon, before I decide to make this even more uncomfortable for you. Brandon stood up slowly, looking around the room one last time, like maybe someone would defend him. Maybe someone would say this wasn't fair. Maybe someone would save him from the consequences of his own actions. No one did. He walked out of that boardroom with everyone's eyes on him, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded like the end of something. After he left, Sarah turned to the rest of us. Derek, we'll discuss your role in this later, but I want to be clear that I'm deeply disappointed in your oversight of this project. You should have verified attribution before giving Brandon this presentation opportunity. I know, Derek said quietly. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't fix it. Rachel, I want you to work with Maya to do the Series D presentation next week. The real presentation, with proper attribution. Absolutely, Rachel said. Sarah looked at me. Maya, I owe you an apology. You shouldn't have had to fight for recognition of your own work. That's a failure of leadership and management at multiple levels. Thank you for having the courage to speak up, and thank you for having the foresight to document everything. That kind of thoroughness and preparation is exactly the kind of leadership quality we value. Thank you, I said, and I wasn't sure if I was going to cry or scream or laugh hysterically. The board members spent another 20 minutes asking me direct questions about the project, the technical decisions, the implementation challenges, the performance results. Questions Brandon had fielded incorrectly or incompletely. Questions I could answer with the deep knowledge that comes from actually building something, instead of just presenting someone else's work. By the end of those 20 minutes, everyone in that room understood who had actually led Project Fortress. Not because I'd demanded they believe me, not because I'd thrown a fit or gotten emotional, but because I'd had evidence, timestamps, commit histories, documentation. Proof that was impossible to argue with. The meeting adjourned at noon, 2 hours after it started. People filed out slowly, several stopping to say something to me. Tom telling me he'd known I was the real lead and should have said something sooner. Richard Chen saying he was impressed with both the technical work and how I'd handled the situation. Patricia Morrison handing me her card and telling me to call her if I ever wanted to discuss opportunities at other companies. Jasmine was waiting for me outside the boardroom, having somehow heard what happened through the office gossip network that moves faster than Slack. You did it, she said, hugging me hard. You actually fucking did it. I did something. I'm not sure what yet. You stood up for yourself. You had receipts. You made them see the truth. That's everything. We went to my desk and I collapsed into my chair, the adrenaline finally wearing off, leaving me shaking and exhausted and not entirely sure what I'd just done to my career. What if they fire me? I said quietly. For what? Having documentation showing you did your job? For making them look bad. For embarrassing Derek. For disrupting an important meeting. Then you lawyer up and you sue them for retaliation. But they won't fire you. They can't. Not after what just happened in that boardroom. She was right. Within the hour, I got a Slack message from Sarah asking me to come to her office. Sarah's office was on the 26th floor, corner office with ridiculous views, decorated with awards and photos from her previous companies. She gestured for me to sit in one of the comfortable chairs by her window. That took guts, Sarah said without preamble. What you did in that meeting. I was terrified I was about to get fired. For what? Telling the truth? Maya, if we fired people for documenting their work and demanding proper attribution, we'd be a terrible company. And we might be a lot of things, but I'd like to think we're not that. So what happens now? Now we investigate formally to make sure we have everything documented correctly. Now Derek gets a serious reprimand and mandatory management training. Now we implement better systems to prevent this from happening again. And now you present your work to the board next week, properly credited. What about Brandon? What about him? He attempted to steal credit for 8 months of your work. He systematically misrepresented his role to leadership. He stood in front of the board and lied. He's done. Part of me feels bad. Don't, Sarah interrupted. Don't feel bad for someone who tried to steal your career advancement. He made his choices. He dealt with the consequences. That's how accountability works. I guess I wasn't trying to destroy his career. I just wanted credit for my work. And that's reasonable and appropriate. What destroyed his career wasn't you speaking up. It was his decision to steal your work in the first place. You were just the person who refused to let him get away with it. Sarah leaned forward. Can I tell you something about what happened in that boardroom? Sure. When you stood up and started presenting evidence, I wasn't surprised. Disappointed, angry, embarrassed that it got that far? Yes, but not surprised. Want to know why? Why? Because this happens. All the time. In tech, in finance, in every industry where there's competition for recognition and advancement. Men taking credit for women's work. White people taking credit for people of color's work. People with confidence and presentation skills taking credit for people who do the actual labor. It's so common that most women and people of color just accept it as the cost of having a career. So why did you seem so angry in the meeting? Because I'm sick of it. Because I've seen too many talented people leave companies or leave industries entirely because they got tired of fighting for credit for their own work. Because I know that for every Maya who has the documentation and the courage to speak up, there are 10 other people who just quietly accept being erased. She pulled out a folder from her desk. After the meeting, I had HR pull data on project attribution over the past 2 years. Do you know what we found? What? In projects with mixed gender teams, men were credited as project leads 73% of the time, even when contribution analysis showed they did less than half the work. In projects with people of color as actual leads, they were credited as leads only 48% of the time, meaning more often than not, even when they led projects, someone else got the credit. The numbers were staggering but not surprising. What are you going to do about it? We're implementing new policies, required documentation of contributions, multiple sign-offs on attribution before public presentations, regular reviews of who's getting credit for what work, and we're making it clear that credit theft will be treated as seriously as any other form of theft, cause for immediate termination. That's good. It's not good enough, but it's a start. And Maya, you're going to help me implement it. I want you working with Rachel and HR to design these systems, because you understand the problem better than most people in this building. I left Sarah's office an hour later with a task force assignment, a promise of a promotion review within 2 months, and the first stirrings of something that felt like hope. Brandon was fired 3 days later after HR completed their investigation. They found that he'd not only misrepresented his role on Project Fortress, but had done similar things on 2 smaller projects earlier in his tenure, taking more credit than he deserved, positioning himself as more central than he'd been. The pattern was clear. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was how he operated. I heard through the office grapevine that he'd tried to argue it was just a misunderstanding, that he genuinely believed he'd contributed more than the record showed, that commit statistics didn't tell the whole story. But when HR showed him the same evidence I'd shown the boardroom, he didn't have a defense. He sent me an email on his last day. A long, rambling thing about how he hadn't meant to hurt me, how he'd just been trying to advance his career, how he hadn't realized how much it would affect me. Not quite an apology, more of an explanation, an excuse, a plea for understanding. I deleted it without responding. He didn't deserve my emotional labor, my forgiveness, my understanding. He deserved the consequences of his actions and nothing more. If you're still here, if you followed me through this entire journey, hit that like button and turn on those notifications, because the story doesn't end with Brandon's firing. The real story is about what came next, how one confrontation in a boardroom changed not just my career but the culture of an entire company. The week after Brandon's termination, I presented Project Fortress to the board. The real presentation, properly attributed, with my name front and center. I walked them through the architecture I'd designed, the decisions I'd made, the implementation challenges I'd solved. I answered questions with the deep knowledge that comes from actually building something, not just reading documentation about it. The board was impressed. More than impressed. Richard Chen from Sequoia said it was one of the most technically solid presentations he'd seen from a Series C company. Patricia Morrison from Andreessen Horowitz asked detailed questions about my architectural thinking and seemed satisfied with every answer. At the end of the presentation, Sarah announced that I was being promoted to principal engineer, effective immediately. Not in 2 months after a review, but now. Recognition that should have come regardless, but felt sweeter, because it came with the understanding of what I'd fought through to get it. The promotion came with a significant salary increase, up to $215,000 base, plus a refresh on my equity grant that would be worth real money if we successfully closed Series D and eventually IPO'd or got acquired. But more than the money, it came with authority. As a principal engineer, I'd have influence over technical direction, voice in architectural decisions, a seat at tables where strategy got determined. I'd be one of 3 principal engineers at the company, the only woman in that role, the only person of color. It felt like vindication. It felt like justice. It felt like proof that speaking up had been the right choice. But it also felt like weight, like responsibility. Like everyone would be watching to see if I deserved the promotion or if it was just guilt-driven affirmative action to make the company feel better about how badly they'd mishandled the Brandon situation. I threw myself into the role with the same intensity I'd brought to Project Fortress, led the task force on attribution policies, mentored junior engineers, especially women and people of color who reached out saying they'd heard what happened and wanted to learn from someone who'd successfully fought back. Started speaking up in meetings when I saw credit being misattributed, gently but firmly correcting the record. Actually, that was Priya's idea. Marcus designed that approach. Let's make sure we're crediting the right person here. The culture started to shift, slowly, incrementally. Engineers started documenting their work more thoroughly. Managers started verifying attribution before presentations. People started speaking up when credit was misallocated instead of just accepting it. It wasn't perfect. Old habits die hard, and unconscious bias doesn't disappear overnight. But it was better, measurably better. By summer 2025, 3 months after the boardroom confrontation, TechVantage had successfully closed its Series D funding round, $250 million, at a valuation that made us officially a unicorn, worth over $1 billion on paper. In the investor presentations and press releases, Project Fortress was highlighted as a key technical achievement, demonstrating our ability to build enterprise-grade infrastructure. My name was front and center in all the materials. Sarah had personally made sure of it. "We're not making that mistake again," she'd told me. "Your work gets proper attribution. Always." The equity grant from my promotion was now worth significantly more. My original stock options from joining the company were worth over $800,000 on paper. Not life-changing money yet, not until we IPO'd or got acquired, but meaningful recognition of my contributions. My parents finally understood why I'd chosen tech over medicine or law. "You're not just building plumbing," my mother said when I told her about the promotion and the Series D. "You're building systems that make companies work. That's important. And you stood up for yourself," my father added with pride in his voice. "You didn't let someone steal from you. That takes courage." Chidi called from New York to congratulate me and to gloat that his advice had been right. "Told you to bring receipts. Told you to speak up. Proud of you, little sister." Amara, finishing her residency, sent me a long text about how she'd experienced similar credit theft in medical training. Male residents taking credit for her diagnoses, attendings assuming the men had led procedures she'd actually performed. "But I never had the documentation you had. I just had to accept it. You showed me a better way." In August 2025, I was invited to speak at Grace Hopper, the largest conference for women in computing. The conference organizers had heard about what happened at TechVantage and wanted me to tell the story. to talk about documentation and attribution and fighting for your work. I almost said no. Talking about the Brandon situation still felt raw, vulnerable, like exposing something painful for public consumption. But Jasmine convinced me. "This is bigger than you now," she said. "This is about every woman and person of color who's had their work stolen and didn't know how to fight back. You have a platform. Use it." So I did. I stood on that stage in front of thousands of women in tech and told the story. The authentication project, the systematic credit theft, the documentation I'd kept, the boardroom confrontation, the evidence that saved my career. I walked them through specific examples of how Brandon had gradually shifted his language to take more credit. I showed redacted screenshots of Slack messages demonstrating the pattern. I explained how commit histories and documentation had provided undeniable proof of who did what work. And I gave them actionable advice. Document everything. Keep your own records. Screenshot your Slack conversations. Back up your commit histories. Save your design documents. Not because you're paranoid, not because you don't trust your colleagues, but because you deserve to have proof of your own accomplishments. Because when, not if, but when, someone tries to minimize your contributions or take credit for your work, you need evidence. I talked about the emotional cost of fighting back, the fear of being labeled difficult or not a team player, the risk of retaliation. It's not fair that we have to fight for credit for our own work. It's not fair that we need documentation to prove what everyone watched us do. But until we fix the systems that enable credit theft, we need to protect ourselves. The response was overwhelming. The standing ovation lasted over 3 minutes. Women lined up for hours afterward to share their own stories. Senior engineers who'd had men take credit for their architecture, junior developers who'd had their code attributed to others, technical writers whose documentation had been presented as someone else's work, project managers whose organizing labor had been made invisible. I thought I was the only one, woman after woman told me. I thought I was being oversensitive. I thought I should just focus on doing good work, and the credit would come. The credit doesn't just come, I told them. You have to fight for it, and to fight for it, you need proof. The talk was recorded and posted on YouTube. Within a week, it had 500,000 views. Within a month, over 2 million. The comments section became a repository of stories. Women sharing their own experiences of credit theft, their strategies for documentation, their successes and failures in fighting back. Tech journalists started reaching out, wanting to write about the broader pattern of credit theft in the industry. I did interviews with TechCrunch, Wired, The Verge, explaining that what had happened to me wasn't unique or even unusual. It was systemic, predictable, and preventable if companies cared enough to implement proper attribution systems. The tech industry loves to talk about meritocracy, I said in one interview. But you can't have meritocracy without attribution. You can't reward merit if you don't know who's actually doing the work. And when systems allow people like Brandon to steal credit without consequences, you don't have meritocracy. You have theft masquerading as success. The articles sparked conversations at companies across the industry. I started getting consulting requests, companies wanting help designing attribution systems, implementing documentation requirements, training managers to verify credit before presentations. By fall 2025, I'd consulted with 15 companies on their attribution policies. Some were doing it because they genuinely wanted to fix the problem. Others were doing it for optics, to appear progressive without changing their underlying culture. I could usually tell the difference within the first meeting. The companies that were serious about change implemented real systems, required documentation, multiple verification points, consequences for credit theft, regular audits of who was getting recognized for what work. The companies that weren't serious just added a policy document to their handbook and called it a day. I started tracking which companies made real changes and which didn't, built a database of best practices, case studies, implementation strategies. Started thinking about this as more than just my personal story, as a systemic problem that needed systematic solutions. In October 2025, 6 months after the boardroom confrontation, I got an unexpected message on LinkedIn from Brandon. I stared at the notification for a long time before opening it. Part of me wanted to delete it unread, to maintain the boundary I'd created, to not give him any more of my emotional energy. But curiosity won. The message was long, several paragraphs of what appeared to be genuine reflection, though I'd learned not to trust my read on Brandon's sincerity. Maya, I know I don't deserve your time or attention, but I wanted to reach out. Not to ask for forgiveness or to make excuses, but to say I'm sorry. Really sorry. Not the corporate non-apology I gave when I was fired. What I did was wrong. I knew it was wrong while I was doing it, and I did it anyway because I thought I could get away with it. I told myself I was just positioning myself for career advancement, that everyone does it, that it wasn't that bad because I'd done some work on the project. But it was that bad. It was theft. And you had every right to expose me the way you did. I've spent the past 6 months in therapy trying to understand why I thought I was entitled to take credit for your work. It's connected to a lot of things: imposter syndrome, childhood issues around achievement and recognition, the way I was socialized to see success as a zero-sum game where my advancement required someone else's diminishment. None of that excuses what I did, but it's helping me understand myself better. I'm also working with a career coach who specializes in accountability and ethics. Part of my work with her is making genuine amends to people I've harmed professionally. So here's what I want you to know. You were a brilliant engineer and an excellent project lead. Your architecture for Project Fortress was elegant, your implementation was clean, your documentation was thorough. I learned a tremendous amount from working with you, and instead of acknowledging that and supporting your leadership, I tried to steal your work and take credit for your accomplishments. That was cowardly, dishonest, and exactly the kind of behavior that drives talented people out of tech. You handled the boardroom confrontation with remarkable professionalism and preparation. Having evidence, presenting it clearly, staying calm under pressure, all of that showed leadership qualities I don't actually possess. I hope you're getting the recognition you always deserved. I hope TechVantage has learned from this situation. And I hope that by speaking up the way you did, you've made it harder for people like me to do what I did to you. I'm not in tech anymore. After I was fired, I did some soul searching about whether I actually enjoyed engineering or whether I'd just been chasing status and recognition. Turns out it was mostly the latter. I'm working in project management now for a nonprofit focused on educational equity. The pay is worse, the prestige is non-existent, but I'm learning to measure success by impact rather than recognition. It's been good for me. I don't expect you to respond to this message. I don't expect forgiveness or absolution. I just wanted you to know that I'm doing the work to be better, and that your courage in standing up to me probably prevented me from doing the same thing to other people down the line. So in a weird way, being caught and facing consequences was one of the best things that could have happened to me. I hope you're well. I hope your career continues to flourish. You deserve all of it. Brandon. I read the message 3 times, trying to parse whether it was genuine or just another performance, another calculated attempt to manage his image. The therapy details felt specific. The acknowledgement of harm felt thorough. The recognition of my leadership felt sincere. But I'd also watched Brandon perform sincerity for 8 months while systematically stealing my credit. Could someone change that fundamentally in 6 months? Or was this just a more sophisticated version of the same manipulation? I sat with the message for a week, showing it to Jasmine and Chidi and asking for their reads. Sounds genuine to me, Jasmine said. But you know him better. Trust your gut. Could be real growth, Chidi said. Or could be an attempt to rehabilitate his image in case he ever wants to return to tech. Hard to know. Does it matter? Amara asked when I showed her. Whether he's genuinely sorry or just performing remorse, the outcome is the same. He's out of your workplace, out of your industry, and you got the recognition you deserved. His internal emotional state isn't your responsibility. She was right. His growth or lack thereof wasn't my problem to solve. I wrote back after a week of consideration. Thank you for the message. I appreciate that you're doing work to understand your behavior and that you're making different choices going forward. I hope you've genuinely learned from this experience and that you treat future colleagues with more integrity than you showed me. I won't forget what happened, but I'm also not interested in holding on to anger about it. I'm focused on moving forward with my own career and helping create systems that make it harder for what you did to happen to others. His response came quickly. That's more grace than I deserve. Thank you. And thank you for the work you're doing on attribution systems. I saw your Grace Hopper talk. It was powerful and important. I'm sorry you had to live through that experience to be able to speak to it. I didn't respond to that message. Felt like the conversation had reached a natural endpoint, and I had no interest in becoming pen pals with the person who'd tried to steal 8 months of my career. Whether Brandon had genuinely changed or was just playing a longer game of reputation management, I'd never know for sure. And Amara was right. It didn't matter. He was gone from my professional life. I'd moved on. By winter 2025, 9 months after the confrontation, my life looked completely different from how it had looked the previous March. I was a principal engineer with real authority and influence. I was a recognized speaker on attribution and credit in tech. I was consulting with companies on implementing better systems. I was mentoring a dozen junior engineers, most of them women and people of color who'd reached out after hearing my story. And I'd started a side project that was becoming something bigger than I'd initially planned. The idea had come from talking to so many engineers who'd experienced credit theft, but didn't have the documentation to fight back. They'd tell me stories of work stolen, ideas appropriated, contributions erased, but they'd never kept records because they hadn't known they needed to. "I wish I'd had your organizational system," one woman told me after a talk I gave. "I wish I'd kept screenshots and commit histories, but I was just trying to do my job. I didn't know I needed to be building a legal case against my own coworker." That stuck with me. The idea that documenting your work should be automatic, built into the tools you already use, not an extra burden on top of your actual job. So I started building a tool. Working nights and weekends, the way I'd worked on Project Fortress, except this time for myself instead of for TechVantage. I called it Proof, a simple name for a simple concept. It was a browser extension that automatically logged your contributions across development tools. It tracked your commits to GitHub, your messages in Slack, your docs in Google Drive and Confluence, your designs in Figma. It generated reports showing what you'd worked on, when, and with whom. It created an automatic paper trail of your professional accomplishments. I showed an early prototype to Jasmine in December. We were having dinner at her apartment in Logan Square. Takeout Thai food spread across her coffee table, while we talked about work and life and whether either of us would ever find time to date. "This is brilliant," she said, clicking through the interface. "This is exactly what people need." It's still rough. Lots of bugs. The UI is terrible. The data model needs work. Maya, stop engineering braining this. The core concept is sound. You're solving a real problem that affects thousands of people, probably tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. You think people would actually use it? Are you kidding? Every woman in tech I know would install this immediately. Every person of color who's had their work stolen would want this. This isn't just a useful tool. This is essential infrastructure for anyone who can't take credit for granted. I'm thinking about it more seriously. Maybe building it out as a real product instead of just a side project. You should, and you should let me help. Product management is literally my job. I can help you figure out the feature roadmap, the go-to-market strategy, the whole thing. We spent the rest of the night brainstorming. What features would make the tool most useful? How would we handle privacy concerns? People wouldn't want their employers seeing everything they were logging. What would the business model be? Freemium? Enterprise licensing? Something else? By the time Jasmine left at midnight, we had the beginnings of a real plan. Not just a tool, but a company. Not just a side project, but a business that could make a meaningful difference in how credit and attribution worked in tech. I spent the holiday break between Christmas and New Year's building out Proof in earnest. 12 to 14-hour days of coding. The same intensity I'd brought to Project Fortress, but with a different energy. This time, I was building something I fully controlled. Something no one could take credit for. Something that would have my name on it from day one. By early January 2026, I had a working beta. Clean interface, reliable logging, privacy controls that let users choose what to track and what to keep private. Automated reporting that generated attribution documentation with timestamps and evidence. I released it to a small group of beta testers, mostly women and people of color in tech, who I knew from conferences and online communities. The feedback was immediate and enthusiastic. "This is what I've been manually doing for years," one engineer wrote, "but automated and actually reliable. I'm showing this to every woman on my team," another said. "This should be required for every tech worker. Can you add integrations with Jira and Linear? We use those for project management, and I want to track my ticket completions too." I spent February and March iterating based on feedback, adding features, fixing bugs, improving the UI with help from a designer friend who was excited about the concept. Jasmine worked on the business strategy, reaching out to potential investors, thinking about pricing and growth. By April 2026, 1 year after the boardroom confrontation, we were ready for a public launch. Proof 1.0, free for individual users with optional paid tiers for teams and enterprises. We announced it on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Product Hunt, posted about it in tech communities and Slack groups, wrote launch posts explaining what it was, why we'd built it, and how it could help people protect their work. The response exceeded every expectation I'd had. Within 24 hours, we had 5,000 signups. Within a week, 20,000. Within a month, over 100,000 engineers had installed Proof and were using it to track their contributions. The stories started pouring in. engineers who'd caught credit theft early because Proof showed them the pattern before it got too far, managers who'd used Proof reports to fairly attribute work and performance reviews, teams who'd implemented Proof company-wide to create transparency around contributions, and increasingly, lawyers, employment attorneys who saw Proof as a tool for building cases around workplace discrimination and stolen credit, who reached out asking if we could provide expert testimony about attribution patterns, who wanted to use our data in lawsuits against companies that systematically undercredited women and people of color. "You've accidentally built legal tech," Chidi told me when I mentioned the lawyer interest. "Documentation tools are extremely valuable for employment law cases. You should lean into that market." We did. By summer 2026, we'd launched a premium tier specifically for legal documentation, extra security, tamper-proof logs, verified timestamps that would hold up in court. Law firms started subscribing on behalf of their clients. HR departments started requiring it for compliance and fair attribution. Proof wasn't just a tool anymore. It was becoming essential infrastructure for how work got tracked and credited in tech. We raised a seed round in July 2026, $2 million from female-led VCs who understood the problem viscerally, used the money to hire a small team, 3 engineers, 1 designer, 1 operations person. Jasmine quit her job at TechVantage to run Proof full-time as COO. I stayed at TechVantage in my principal engineer role, working on Proof nights and weekends, trying to balance 2 careers that were both demanding and fulfilling in different ways. It was exhausting, but exhilarating. I was building technical systems at TechVantage, while building a company that made those systems more equitable. By fall 2026, Proof had 300,000 users and was growing 20% month over month. We were featured in every major tech publication, covered by business journalists as an example of tools addressing systemic inequity, highlighted by diversity and inclusion advocates as practical infrastructure for change. And we were getting acquisition interest. Larger companies that made development tools wanted to buy us and integrate Proof into their existing platforms. The numbers being discussed were significant, enough to make me financially independent, enough to give everyone on our small team life-changing outcomes. But I wasn't sure I wanted to sell. Proof had started as a reaction to my own experience of credit theft. It had become something bigger, a tool that thousands of people relied on, a platform for creating fairer attribution systems, a company with a mission that mattered. "What do you want?" Jasmine asked me one night in October, both of us exhausted from back-to-back meetings with potential acquirers. "I want to keep building. I want Proof to become the standard for how work gets tracked and credited. I want to solve this problem systematically instead of just selling the tool to a big company that might kill it or deprioritize it." Then we don't sell. We raise a Series A, we build the team, we execute on the vision. We turn this into a real company instead of a successful exit. We turned down the acquisition offers and raised a Series A in December 2026, $12 million at a $75 million valuation. Used the money to scale the team, build enterprise features, expand into new markets beyond just software development. Because we'd realized the problem wasn't just in tech. Credit theft happened in consulting, in academia, in creative industries, in any field where collaboration made attribution complicated, and power dynamics made some people's contributions more visible than others. Proof for architects, Proof for consultants, Proof for researchers, Proof for writers and designers and anyone whose collaborative work could be stolen by someone with more confidence or privilege or access to recognition. By early 2027, 2 years after the boardroom confrontation that had changed my life, Proof had over 1 million users across multiple industries. We'd become the default tool for attribution and documentation, integrated with every major collaboration platform required by many progressive companies as part of their equity and inclusion initiatives. And I'd become someone I hadn't planned to be. A founder, a CEO-adjacent executive. Jasmine was CEO, I was Chief Product Officer. A voice on systemic inequality and professional recognition. My identity had shifted from talented engineer to engineer who'd fought back publicly and built something to help others do the same. TechVantage IPO'd in March 2027. My equity from 4.5 years there was suddenly worth $3.2 million. Life-changing money. Money that meant I'd never have to worry about financial security again. Money that meant I could take risks, support my family, invest in causes I cared about, fund Proof's growth without depending on external capital. My parents finally stopped asking when I was going to get a stable job. Hard to argue with a multiple $1 million liquidity event and a fast-growing company that was changing how industries thought about credit and recognition. In May 2027, I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee investigating workplace discrimination in tech. They were specifically interested in patterns of credit theft, attribution bias, and how documentation tools like Proof could create more equitable systems. I sat in front of cameras and congressional representatives and told my story again: the authentication project, Brandon's systematic theft, the boardroom confrontation, the evidence that saved my career. And then I expanded it, talking about the thousands of stories we'd collected through Proof, the patterns we'd identified, the systematic nature of the problem. Representative Collins, you asked whether this is really a widespread issue or just isolated incidents, I said in response to a question from a skeptical Republican representative. Our data from Proof shows that in collaborative tech projects, women receive proper attribution for their contributions about 62% of the time, while men receive proper attribution about 89% of the time. For people of color, attribution rates are even lower, 57%. What this means is that in nearly half of collaborative projects, people of color are not properly credited for work they actually did. But couldn't that be explained by the level of actual contribution? He pushed back. Maybe these groups are doing less work? Our data tracks actual contributions, commits, documents created, decisions made, hours logged. We're not measuring perceived contribution. We're measuring actual work output. And what we see is that even when women and people of color do equal or greater work than their colleagues, they receive less recognition. That's not a skill gap. That's a recognition gap. That's systemic bias in how we attribute credit. The testimony was covered widely. It sparked conversations in companies that had been resistant to acknowledging the problem. It led to proposed legislation around attribution requirements in federal tech contracts. It positioned Proof as not just a useful tool, but as essential infrastructure for equity. By summer 2027, we were in conversations with several state governments about requiring Proof or similar tools for public sector tech projects. We were consulting with universities about implementing attribution systems for research collaboration. We were expanding internationally, translating the tool into multiple languages, adapting it for different professional contexts. And I was exhausted, working a demanding role at TechVantage while running product for a fast-growing startup while speaking at conferences and consulting with companies and testifying to Congress. It was too much. Something had to give. I gave notice at TechVantage in August 2027. It was time. I'd been there 5.5 years, had accomplished what I'd set out to accomplish, had proven myself as a technical leader. Rachel understood. Sarah understood. They offered to keep me on as a consultant, to stay involved in the technical strategy, to maintain the relationship. I agreed. Part-time consulting for TechVantage, full-time focus on Proof. Best of both worlds, staying connected to technical engineering work while building a company that mattered. Leaving TechVantage felt strange. That building, that team, that company had been the site of both my worst professional experience and my greatest professional triumph. The place where Brandon had tried to steal my career and where I'd fought back and won. The place where I'd learned that documentation and evidence and willingness to confront injustice could change outcomes. My last day was September 15th, 2027. The engineering team threw me a going-away party in the office. People gave speeches about what I'd contributed, technically, culturally, systemically. Rachel talked about the attribution policies we'd created together. Derek, who'd survived his reprimand and become a much better manager in the process, apologized again for his role in the Brandon situation and thanked me for forcing the company to confront its blind spots. "You made us better," he said. "Not just by building great systems, but by demanding that we properly recognize who builds those systems. That's leadership." The party was lovely. The speeches were generous. The gifts were thoughtful. But what stuck with me most was something a junior engineer named Michelle said during the open mic portion. "I'm a Black woman in tech," she said. "I started at TechVantage 2 years ago, right after the Brandon situation happened. And I want you to know that your story, what you did in that boardroom, the way you stood up for yourself with evidence and preparation, that literally changed whether I felt safe here. Because you showed that this company would listen to Proof, that documentation mattered, that speaking up could work. You created a template for how to fight back against credit theft, and you created systems that made it less likely to happen in the first place. That's the kind of impact that extends way beyond any code you wrote." I hugged her and tried not to cry, and failed. Because she was right. The code I'd written would eventually be deprecated, replaced, upgraded. But the cultural systems, the attribution policies, the example of standing up with evidence, those would persist. That was legacy. The fall of 2027 brought new challenges. Proof was growing fast, now at 2 million users, expanding into new industries, raising a Series B, $40 million at a $300 million valuation. The team had grown to 40 people. The pressure was intense, but it was pressure I'd chosen, in service of a mission I believed in, and the impact was real. We were hearing stories constantly about credit theft prevented, contributions properly recognized, bias identified and corrected. Law firms were using our data in discrimination cases. Companies were changing their cultures because our tools made bias visible. People who'd been systematically undercredited for years were finally getting recognition. In November 2027, I spoke at a conference about attribution and equity. During the Q&A, someone asked, "Do you ever regret speaking up in that boardroom? Would your career be easier if you'd stayed quiet?" I thought about it for a moment. My career would definitely be easier if I'd stayed quiet. I wouldn't have had to deal with the stress of confrontation, the risk of retaliation, the emotional cost of fighting back. But my career also wouldn't be mine. It would belong to someone else. Brandon would have the recognition, the promotion, the platform. I would have done the work, and he would have reaped the rewards. So no, I don't regret speaking up. I regret that I had to. I regret that our systems are set up in ways that make credit theft possible, and even common. But I don't regret fighting for what was mine. The answer got a standing ovation. People understood. People had lived versions of that same story, made versions of that same choice, regretted that the choice had to be made at all. By the end of 2027, almost 3 years after that late-night coding session at 2:37 a.m., and my life bore almost no resemblance to what I'd imagined when I started Project Fortress. I was no longer a senior engineer grinding on infrastructure projects. I was CPO of a fast-growing company, a recognized leader in tech equity, someone whose story had sparked systemic changes across the industry. I'd gone from making $130,000 to being worth multiple millions on paper from TechVantage equity and proof stock. From worrying about affording my apartment to being able to support my parents' retirement and help my siblings with their careers. From being invisible in a boardroom to being someone whose presence changed the conversation. And all of it started with keeping records, with documenting my work, with having the evidence I needed to prove what everyone should have already known. My coworker pitched my build as his. The Slack timestamps rolled, and the boardroom went silent. That moment of silence was the sound of truth being impossible to deny, the sound of bias meeting evidence and losing, the sound of systems failing to protect injustice when someone had the courage and preparation to expose it. If you've made it this far in my story, thank you. Really, truly, thank you for witnessing this journey. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications because the work continues. The work of building better attribution systems. The work of making credit theft harder and proper recognition easier. The work of creating tools and cultures where everyone's contributions are visible and valued. I'm Maya Okafor. I'm 34 years old now, 3 years after the confrontation that changed my trajectory. I'm Chief Product Officer of Proof, a company worth hundreds of millions that helps 2 million people protect their work and get proper credit. I'm a former principal engineer who built critical infrastructure that still runs at TechVantage. I'm a speaker, an advocate, a person who stood up when it mattered most. And I'm Proof, lowercase p, that documentation saves careers, that evidence matters, that having the courage to confront injustice with preparation and professionalism can change not just your outcomes but the systems themselves. The timestamps don't lie. The commit histories don't lie. The Slack messages don't lie. And neither should you when someone tries to steal what you've built. Document everything. Know your worth. Have your evidence ready. And when the moment comes to fight for your work, fight with data, not just emotion. Fight with proof. Thank you for being part of the story. Remember, you deserve credit for your work. You deserve recognition for your contributions. You deserve to have your name on what you've built. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. And always, always keep receipts. The timestamps saved my career. They can save yours too.